All right. Welcome to First Chair Chats, everyone. I'm so excited for you all to be here for this panel discussion with Julia Keefe and Dr. John Carlos Perea. Kweweti Joseph Sioui Yatsit Shia Wendat Ndi. My name is Joseph Sioui, and I'm a citizen of the Huron-Wendat First Nation. I am a music resource officer here at the UNT Native American Student Association and a graduate assistant at the Music Library. Before I introduce our guests, I just want to welcome Olivia Snediger, who is our UNT Native American Student Association representative and former president, to deliver a land acknowledgement and recognize the Muskogee connection to UNT. So I'll pass it over to you, Olivia.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event. My name is Olivia Snediger. I am a member of the UNT Native American Student Association, as Joseph has said, and I have familial ancestry of both the Lakota and Cherokee nations. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the land on which we find ourselves today. A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people that have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long existing history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of this present participation. It is also worth noting that acknowledging the land is Indigenous protocol. We would like to open our event today by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the occupied seized territory of the Wichita and affiliated tribes in the Caddo Nation. These tribes have been stewards of this land for many generations, and we would like to pay our respects to elders both past and present. So to give a little bit of history with Native American representation in UNT, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the history from when our college was founded. So the Texas Normal College and Teachers Training Institute, now known as UNT, was founded in 1890, located on the square downtown. The university was unable to make enrollment requirements and was not going to be able to stay open if it could not get more students. In order to make these enrollment requirements, UNT enrolled 28 members of the Muskogee Creek Nation from Indian Territory, now known as Oklahoma. If it weren't for these students, UNT would not be here today. So the university has Native students to thank for their success, being the third largest university of Texas. This goes to show that UNT has a rich history with members of the Native American community, and us and NASA are proud to provide a space for current Native Indigenous students. We meet every Monday at 5:30 in the Center for Belonging and Engagement. If you are a Native student and you're seeking a community, we would love for you to join us. Thank you. I'm going to pass it back to you now.
All right. Thank you so much, Olivia. Before we begin, I just want to invite everyone to submit questions in the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A at any time. And one of my fellow librarians will read them out at the end. And so now I'd like to introduce you all to our incredible guests. Julia Keefe is an internationally acclaimed Native American jazz vocalist, band leader, actor, and educator currently based in New York City. Her professional career has spanned nearly 2 decades, and she has headlined marquee events at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., the National Museum of the American Indian in New York, as well as opened for the likes of 20-time Grammy Award winner Tony Bennett and 4-time Grammy Award winner Esperanza Spalding. Her life's work is to the revival and honoring of the legendary Coeur d'Alene jazz musician Mildred Bailey, and is leading the campaign for Bailey's induction into the Jazz Hall of Fame at Lincoln Center. In addition to rehearsing for an upcoming album, she is currently directing the Julia Keefe Indigenous Big Band, a new project highlighting the history and future of Indigenous people in jazz. And the Mildred Bailey Project will be releasing its first studio recording in 2024. And I believe there's already a single out, right? John Carlos Perea is an electric bassist, singer, cedar flutist, composer, and ethnomusicologist. He's an associate professor of ethnomusicology in the School of Music and an adjunct associate professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Washington. Perea's research and teaching interests include jazz and improvised music, performance and composition, urban intertribal American Indian lived experiences and cultural productions, Native and African American jazz cultures, and the Creek and Caw saxophonist Jim Pepper. Perea has recorded 3 albums as a leader, First Dance, Creation Story, and Cedar Flute Songs, and was awarded a Grammy for his vocal, powwow drum, and cedar flute contributions to the 2007 Paul Winter Consort album, Creststone. His most recent release is a collaborative native improvised trio project with myself, Joseph Sioui, and guitarist Marcus Touton. Julia and John Carlos, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you both. I want to give you a chance to introduce yourselves and ask you what experiences first inspired you to be a musician that is proud to express your identity through music. And I'll start with Julia, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah. Well, first, Tatse Pine Oikalo, Inuinakisa Himumukatse, Inuminikwas Julia Keefe. Good day, everyone. My name is Himumukatse. That's Nimiputimpt, the native language of my tribe. And it means she calls out from on high. I also go by Julia Keefe. I'm a member of the Nez Perce tribe, originally from, I was born in Seattle, Washington, but I spent my early childhood years on my tribe's reservation in Kamiah, Idaho, before moving to Spokane, Washington, and then off into the world doing, college-y, student-y things all over the country. And I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much for allowing me to share this virtual space with you. I know we have this all written out. So the first question, that it was about what inspired me to incorporate my Indigenous identity into my music. Correct, Joseph? Was that the first question?
Right. Yeah.
Ish
Yes.
kabibble? Okay, cool. So it's actually kind of wild. I mean, I got into jazz. My first musical memory is listening to jazz music. My first musical memory was listening to Billie Holiday, and I had to have been maybe about 4. And when you think about Billie Holiday and like the heaviness and the cerebralness and the complexity of, the tunes that she did and the arrangements that she did with jazz orchestras, and, trumpets with harmon mutes and everything, it's kind of a weird thing to really latch into a 4-year-old's brain, that sound. But oh man, Billie Holiday just became sort of the ghost of my childhood, who haunted me in the best possible way. And I started studying jazz music when I was in my early teens. But coming up, I didn't really feel that it was okay to be a native jazz musician, without being able to talk about the historical precedent of Indigenous people in jazz. So when I would just be doing, standards or straight ahead things that weren't tied to Mildred Bailey in particular, I would often get approached, during or after a gig with like, what do you mean? What do you mean you're a Native American jazz musician? What do you mean by that? It's like, oh, well, I'm Native American and I sing jazz. I don't see how there's a conflict, but for some folks there was conflict. And it really wasn't until I stumbled across the name of Mildred Bailey and soon, discovered for myself that she was of the Coeur d'Alene tribe, and she also, grew up in Spokane, Washington, and she was, a huge influence on Bing Crosby, and she was the first woman to sing in front of a big band in the late 1920s, early 1930s. It wasn't until I saw that representation within the pages of jazz history that I felt that I could really talk about myself. And and the bridging of those two identities. I felt like it gave me permission to exist in that space as both Indigenous and a jazz musician. But you know, as I got older, it wasn't until COVID actually, and I got connected with another jazz musician, Indigenous jazz musician, Delbert Anderson. And we started talking about, you know, collaborating and all the different projects that we could do together, that I started to become a little more unapologetic in the marriage of those two identities, that, you know, I don't have to justify it. I am who I am, and people will take me or leave me, whatever, it's fine. But it really wasn't until I started seeing that community and building that community that incorporating Indigenous musical traditions into my jazz practice felt more authentic, and felt like, you know, yeah, there is space. I gave myself permission at that point, because I stopped trying to please, you know, jazz audiences and meet their expectations. I decided that, you know, I have my own expectations, and that's okay. So anyways, I hope that answered the question. It was a very long-winded answer.
Absolutely. And John Carlos?
So my name is Basil Kai, my name is Hinhan Wakang, and my name is John Carlos Perea. I was born in Dulce, New Mexico. My mother is Barbara Perea from Belmore, Long Island, New York. My father is Jacob Perea from Las Cruces, New Mexico. I'm German-Irish on my mom's side, and Mescalero, Apache, and Chicano on my dad's side. Born in Dulce, raised in San Francisco. My mother was a high school vice principal in San Francisco, and my father had various faculty positions at San Francisco State, beginning with the College of Ethnic Studies. He was a striker for the College of Ethnic Studies on the 1969 side of the strikes. He and my mother left to go to the, well, they started out first at the Rough Rock Demonstration School, where my dad was the principal and my mom taught at the school. Then they went to Dulce, where I was born. My dad was director of what they called back then Title IX Indian Education. My mom also taught at the schools there. Then they came back to San Francisco, and my dad had a number of positions, starting out in ethnic studies and then going into education. Or when he finally retired, he was the dean of the Graduate College of Education at San Francisco State. So I come from educator and musicians. I got to hang out with a lot of musicians who were there for Alcatraz, who were there for the picket lines in Delano, and who all had music that was not just part of performing that time period, but part of connecting with that time period and keeping that time period in the present, right? So when I was growing up, that was part of where I began to understand not just ways of being American Indian, but different ways of being what we might now call today Indigenous, right? From different people's perspective and lived experience. I started out playing along with the radio, just kind of turning through and playing along with stuff, right? In the beginning, actually a lot of Grateful Dead, Phil Lesh, right? Who just recently passed on. He was a huge bass influence on me in the beginning. James Jamerson, that kind of stuff on the radio. But I was also going to powwows, and I was trying to figure out how it all connected. Got into a jazz combo class when I was still in high school. It was a combo class at San Francisco State. A woman named Dee Spencer let me in when I was still in high school, and she put John Coltrane in front of me, right? And that was the beginning, because I listened to Coltrane and I thought, wait a minute, it sounds like he went to a powwow. Why does it sound like he went, what's going on here, right? That led to me studying with a tenor saxophonist named Francis Wong, a Chinese-American community activist and tenor saxophonist still in San Francisco. And Francis said, have you ever heard Jim Pepper? And kind of in some ways slightly similar to what Julia was saying, right? That moment of finding Mildred, finding Peppers, okay, now I have a place. Now it's not two separate things like the world was trying to say, right? It was not only is it integrated, not only is it integral, right? But then this whole history opens up and it turns out that it's been there all the time, right? And so I think that for me is how I got to doing the kind of things I do now, and wanting to bring that both to recordings, to live performance, but also figure out how to teach about that to keep the door open for folks who want to continue learning and to continue teaching. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think these answers, beautifully foreshadow what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this webinar here. So Julia, the Julia Keefe Indigenous Big Band has been a huge project of yours in recent years. How did the idea for an all Indigenous Big Band come about?
So the Indigenous Big Band actually came out of the first meeting with Delbert Anderson, Dene trumpeter Delbert Anderson. And so it was during COVID, and Delbert was putting together a proposal for a grant, grant funding, and he posted, are there any Native American female band leaders that anybody knows about? And so I was tagged in it, and what was supposed to be a half-hour conversation of like getting to know you and seeing if the vibe is right, and would I help with that proposal, turned into about a 3-hour conversation, which is usually what happens when I get on the phone with Delbert. We just start brainstorming and dreaming up the big dreams, and it's a really beautiful, time-consuming but incredibly fruitful practice that we have. But within the midst of this conversation, we talked about our influences, we talked about our experiences, we talked about what we would like to see for the future. He told me about some of his projects. I told him about the Mildred Bailey project, which is something that I've been working on since I was about 15, and I'm 35 now, so that's pretty wild, because I still feel like a 15-year-old most of the time. But then we started talking about, big bands and big bands in Indian country, and how, as a result of the Indian boarding school experience, a lot of tribal nations, a lot of tribal lands had their own all native big bands, marching bands, and small jazz ensembles. And Delbert was like, yeah, I've played in big bands before, and I've directed big bands. And I was like, I've sung in front of big bands, and I love big band music. And it was just sort of this off the cuff, like, man, wouldn't it be cool if we had an all native big band? It's like, yeah, man, that would be so hip. Like, well, maybe like if it happens, let me know. I'll be involved. Da, da, da. It was very sort of, it was very much just like a dream that we dreamt and thought that it might never happen. And then, through COVID, this funding organization called South Arts Jazz Roads, they usually help jazz artists with tours, but because no one was touring, they put together a funding opportunity called the Creative Artist Residency. And I saw that come up, and I was thinking about different projects and things like that. And Delbert actually called me and said, hey man, I'm submitting for this project for something else. I'm gonna do a different tour with my smaller ensemble, but you should submit for the big band. Like, let's see if this can come together. And so I put together a proposal. I wrote like the biggest proposal, just jam-packed with like historical precedent. We have a place here in jazz history. This is not something that's beyond the pale to have an all Indigenous big band. And it's also incredibly important to highlight that history, but also the incredibly bright future of Indigenous people in jazz. So I put together this monster of a proposal, and we were awarded full funding, which was great. I was like, yes, oh my gosh. It was like the first grant that I won. But then of course came the huge responsibility and mounting pressure of, okay, now I have this legal obligation to this funder. And I don't know are there Indigenous jazz musicians to fill out the personnel of a big band. So I was, of course, having a lot of anxiety around, did I make a promise I can't fulfill? So then started the big outreach initiative. And Joseph, that's how you and I got connected, was this big outreach on social media and through the colleges and through like, all of the different educators that I know of, like, hey, do you know of any Indigenous jazz musicians who might be interested in getting connected and talking about this big band with me? And the response was so overwhelming and beautiful. I have a huge, huge database now of Indigenous jazz musicians from all over Turtle Island. We span from the Pacific Islands all the way through Canada, down through Central America and into the Caribbean. It's really beautiful, and we have a sort of all-encompassing Indigenous personnel and roster that we can pull from, and it really does showcase that Indigenous America is not monolithic, and the music reflects that as well. So we have enough people to have several big bands, but we were able to get a group of 16 folks together for a premiere in Olympia, Washington in May of 2022 at the Washington Center for Performing Arts. And it was so incredibly inspiring and empowering to have a group of really fantastically talented and dedicated Indigenous jazz musicians coming together and playing Pepper's music and playing Mildred's music and playing original music from band members. That it wasn't just another gig for a lot of us. We were so excited at the music that we just made together that it really has just kind of snowballed since that first performance. And yeah, it's the project that serves the most purpose and for me in building this community and uplifting other Indigenous jazz musicians. And it's taken on a life of its own, and I'm really honored to play a part in it.
Yes, and if I'm not mistaken, there's going to be y'all are going in to record an album momentarily.
We're going into the recording studio in November, less than a month from now, end of November, just before the Thanksgiving holiday.
All right, so look out for that in 2025. Yes, awesome. So I want to transition to talking about Jim Pepper, and you mentioned we've already mentioned his name a couple times, but he was, for those that don't know, an incredible Creek and Cobb saxophonist that had this unique sound and brought native expression to jazz in a way that hadn't been done at that scale or visibility before and in that way. And it really inspired a lot of coming native musicians. So John Carlos, of course, one of your main research interests is Jim Pepper. Can you talk about what draws you in about him and the relevance of his life and incredible music, still today?
So when I think about what was and still is relevant and could continue to be relevant, right? One of the things that I have noticed since we came from San Francisco to Seattle last year is that people are looking for new ways to re-engage with listening, right? Whether that's by going to shows, whether that's by people who've never been in a record store going to a record store just to kind of mess around to find out, right? The students that I'm talking to are saying, during COVID, I did one thing and that's fine because it was COVID and we all did the thing that we needed to do to get through that period of time. But there's a sense of connectivity that they want to be able to find, right, through that act of listening. And when I think of how I found Jim Pepper, right, it gave me a place to hang on to. not a place that defined me, right? But a place that was like a branch in this larger tree that I could then understand different branches coming out from that. And not, as we so often get caught in, whether you're part of jazz academia or not, is we often get caught in immediately, well, what's the value of the branches, right? It's not about the value of the branches, it's about the existence of the tree, right? It's about the existence of the tree. And so that's what it provided for me, right? When I found that. And then I was able to say, okay, Jim Pepper leads to Don Cherry. Jim Pepper leads to Ornette Coleman. Jim Pepper immediately leads to the intersections of Black and American Indian jazz musicians, right? To the point where now with my combo at school that I'm directing, we can talk about Oscar Pettiford, we can talk about Mildred Bailey, we can talk about Jim Pepper, and it's just becoming part of what people do. And they don't understand, right? They, okay, well, people are just picking up and taking it and running with it, and it's wonderful. It's another place for them to find themselves within that tree, right? To talk about what they like about it, and then to be able to understand how they want to pass through it, how they want to see it. Again, not getting caught up on this competition between the branches, but on understanding the importance of the tree existing. That was why it was important for me. And when I see the way that students are trying to reconnect again, and not even students, audience members too, at the shows that I've been able to do since we've been here, right? People want to come, they want to hang out, they want to listen, and they want to talk about it afterwards. So that is part of what I see the importance of Pepper, Mildred Bailey, any of these people we're going to talk about today. It's that point for people to be able to connect and talk about what they're hearing, which it seems like, at least where I am right now, that's something that a lot of people really feel strongly about and want to do.
Absolutely. And I think both Pepper and Bailey and all these other folks are the reason, I got connected with the both of you and that we're able to, talk about all this. So it's really, really nice. And yeah, I want to transition back to Mildred Bailey and want to ask you, Julia, if you could talk about y- a little bit more about your introduction to her and how that culminated into the Mildred Bailey project.
Yeah. Well, coming up, I started my sort of formal jazz education, music education when we moved from my tribe's res up to Spokane. And jazz is already sort of a crucial part of the music education system in the Inland Northwest because of the existence of the Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival at the University of Idaho, and the way that all of the choirs and bands around there operate is that like the whole academic year kind of revolves around Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival. And so I had started singing in choir and I started competing as a soloist at Lionel Hampton. And I was very much, a jazz nerd, and I was just geeking out on all things jazz. And I ended up going to Gonzaga preparatory school for high school. And while I was there, I realized that Bing Crosby went to Gonzaga for high school. It was called Gonzaga High School before it became a preparatory school. But the fact that this, world-class crooner came from the same high school that I went to just completely piqued my interest as a big old nerd. And I say nerd so lovingly, like we're all just, it sounds super self-deprecating, but like I'm realizing that being a nerd just means you're awesome and you have passion, and that's great. So I was reading Bing Crosby's autobiography, Call Me Lucky, and he talked about how fortunate he was to have known the great vocalist, the great singer, Mildred Bailey early in life. And he said she had a heart as big as Yankee Stadium, and all of these really glowing things about this woman that I had never really heard of before. And so I started doing research on Mildred Bailey, and she was from Spokane, and it turns out she, like, her mother was a enrolled member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe and learned how to play piano from the nuns. And they, she grew up on her tribe's reservation before moving to Spokane. And it was sort of the parallel tracks that really inspired me, because like I said, I didn't see my indigeneity, my American Indianness reflected in this art form that I was so incredibly in love with, especially at that time period, because I was very much focused on like the 30s, 40s, like that music, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald. That was like my bread and butter. And so, as I started sort of uncovering and finding the research from, Gary Giddens and, different jazz historians, sort of uncovering this woman and her profound legacy as the first woman to sing in front of a big band with the Paul Whiteman Orchestra, and the profound impact that had on jazz, afterwards. I don't know. I felt that it was weird that I hadn't heard of her before. And during a trip to New York, my family, we ended up coming to New York City just for a little vacation. And my parents took me to jazz at Lincoln Center, and I got to go through the sort of Hall of Fame and look at all those beautiful photos. At that time, there were only 4 women in the Jazz Hall of Fame at Lincoln Center, which already felt like a profound injustice for my gender. And then the next sort of kick in the teeth for me was that Mildred Bailey wasn't one of them. And so, because I come from a family of lawyers and activists, I made it my mission to get Mildred Bailey inducted into the Jazz Hall of Fame at Lincoln Center. And I took up that sort of campaign, and I started a petition, and I started it. When I was gigging in high school, I would dedicate just a song to Mildred Bailey, just to sort of like highlight the history of Indigenous jazz in Spokane. And then it turned into a show dedicated to Mildred Bailey, and I was singing the songs that she made famous and in turn made her famous. And then it turned into a 9-piece band that kicked off. So the Mildred Bailey performance that I did at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. was the first time that museum participated in Jazz Appreciation Month at the Smithsonian. And so usually every museum does their like Jazz Appreciation Month thing, and NMAI hadn't done anything yet at that point. But because of the sort of ball that I got rolling with the sort of Mildred Bailey campaign, I made connections at NMAI, and we were able to premiere that show at NMAI for Jazz Appreciation Month in 2009. Since then, she hasn't been inducted into the Jazz Hall of Fame yet. There's still that effort, but the state of Idaho has recognized Mildred Bailey as a person of importance, and put a declaration down of Mildred Bailey Day on her birthday. The Coeur d'Alene tribe has embraced her as a significant person of importance, and so I think the little bits and pieces that I've been able to do has really created a renaissance for Mildred and the profound impact that she had, not only on American popular music, but on Indian country. And it took me a very long time to go into the studio with the Mildred Bailey Project, but I finally got some grant funding. In case you don't know, like being a jazz musician, you're going to be writing a lot of grants. Just learn how to write a grant, a dirty old grant. We can have a grant writing workshop. I'm happy to go over that, because I believe in you and it's important. But And also, you know, more times than not, you're not going to have a bunch of money to put forward for recording. So you need that grant funding. Anywho, I got a grant for the Mildred Bailey project, and we headed into the studio. And so now we're finally, I'm finally in a position where I can release those arrangements, which were reductions of her big band arrangements, for people to enjoy. So that's the Mildred Bailey of it all.
Absolutely. And yeah, there's always already one single out with the Mildred Bailey project. So definitely check that out. John Carlos, would you mind sharing about your intertribal background experience in San Francisco and how that brought you to playing intertribal powwow music and like protest music?
So I was lucky enough at San Francisco State to grow up around a lot of people who had participated in both the strikes for ethnic studies in 68, 69, including my father, who was there. But then also, I didn't realize it at first, but around people who were part of the first American Indian founding faculty following the Alcatraz occupation, right? The one person in particular, a man named Barney Honer. Barney Honer from Wakpala, South Dakota, Standing Rock. Barney was a good friend of my father's and kind of kept an eye on me as I was growing up. And then once I got, as an undergraduate at San Francisco State, Barney started to ask my dad, well, you better tell John to come take my music class. And I was scared, right? He was older, and I don't know, I'm not sure who this guy is. Why does he want me to come take his class? And so I kept putting it off, right? And then finally my dad said, you know, you're being rude. He's an elder, he's asking you to come to the class. You need to come to the class, right? And so I kind of was okay, and so I signed up for the class. And then I went, and he came in, right? And he came in, he's got on a straw cowboy hat, suspenders, Western shirt, sweatpants. Everybody's trying to figure this guy out. Sweatpants and a Western shirt. What's going on here, right? Who is this guy? And he's sitting there and just really quiet, right? Late 60s, early 70s. The TA's calling the roll, and they said, John Carlos Perea. And I said, here. And he looks up from under the hat, and he kind of looks right at me in my eyes, right? And I thought, oh God, I'm going to get it. And he yelled at me in front of the whole class. He said, John Carlos Perea, where have you been? And I did the exact worst thing I could have done at that point. I said, hi, Barney. And he said, don't you hi, Barney, me. Get up here. And he made me get up in front of the class, and he stood me up there, and he said, everyone, this is John Carlos. I've been telling John Carlos for the past couple of semesters to come and take my class. And he just took me up one side and down the other, right? Then after class, went back to his office, and he said, rehearsals tonight at 7:30, right? And that was it. I spent the next couple of years with him learning how to sing, right? And in that process, kind of getting to be very close up with what his version and the version of the folks who were around, who still remembered that moment around Alcatraz, right? Of what intertribal could mean. For me, it's a song, right? It's a dance, but it's also an organizing strategy, right? And so for me, an intertribal might be tribally specific in terms of that singer was from this place, or these people who are dancing it are from a particular place. But it's also improvisational, because everybody's out there together, even folks who aren't dressed to dance, who might not be native, right? And so for me, that early exposure to both powwow and jazz at the same time helped me to be able to see how Julia had mentioned earlier, the idea that some of these things are monolithic, right? Those experiences for me growing up helped me see that this isn't a monolith, right? People are improvising. They might say, this is how I learned it, right? But once somebody else who does it a little bit different comes out at the same time, they're figuring how to do it together. Might mean they still fight, might mean they still have to work it out, right? But they're still improvising together, right? So that's kind of intertribal for me, coming from those experiences that I give credit and gratitude to Barney Honer for, right? Being able to see intertribal as a song, as a dance, as an organizing strategy, and as a way of improvising in the world. You have to understand what came before you in order to understand how you're going to improvise and respond in the present.
Yes, thank you for that. Julia, you appeared in Sterling Harjo's documentary film, Love and Fury. Of course, Sterling Harjo is a recent MacArthur genius and, has been a genius for many, many years with his work. And, it makes me wonder, how Native representation in entertainment has uh, maybe helped bring voice to Native music as well. Do you think that the Native, like a greater acknowledgement of the or visibility of Natives in the entertainment industry has helped that give a voice to Native musicians?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's sort of echoing what John Carlos said. You have to understand where you came from in order to understand, how to move about in the present and how to improvise in the present. And the beautiful thing about Sterling is that he's been doing this for such a long time. And Indigenous people in the entertainment industry has very much been a part of the fabric of the entertainment industry for such a long time. And I first came across Sterling and his work when I was an intern at the Sundance Film Festival, Sundance Institute, in their Native film program. It's now the Indigenous film program. And that's also where I came across Taika Waititi's work. If you do yourself a favor and watch Taika Waititi's short film, Two Cars, One Night. It was one of his earliest short films. It is so beautiful, and it really does, it's a Maori story, but it really does reflect so much of what we experience across, Indigenous America as well. So definitely check out Two Cars, One Night. But I think the rise of Indigenous stories, Native stories told by Native people, has driven up the need and the appetite and for Indigenous music performed by Indigenous musicians. I think Taika winning the Oscar was a huge step forward. Sterling putting forth Reservation Dogs, having an entirely Native crew, and him also in the curation of music and how he used music in his visual storytelling. I mean, that absolutely elevated Native musicians and their place in the entertainment world. Of course, Lily Gladstone coming forward with Killers of the Flower Moon. She has been active for many, many, many years as an actor. But I do think it is very much all connected. And I think one of the things that I was taught in jazz history from the late trumpeter Floyd Standifer is that you have to look, you can't just look at the historical event by itself. You want to know what's happening socially, politically, economically, and spiritually around that historical event, because it gives you context. And I do think that what was happening as we were heading out of the 20 teens and into the 2020s was leading us towards the amplification of BIPOC voices and stories and peoples. And even if you look at, I know I keep talking about grants and funding and all of this other stuff, but what these foundations were also doing around the same time, as BIPOC voices were really coming to the forefront, funders then started coming in and really prioritized the, ensuring that funds and grants went to BIPOC artists in order to amplify their work. And so I that's a very sort of messy, convoluted answer, but I think it's all very much tied together. I think it has been a long time coming. We are seeing funders starting to shift away from diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and more towards technology. But I think because also in Indian country, like once we open a door, it's not just one of us walking through, we keep the door open and we bring our whole family. And that's really beautiful. And I think because Sterling very much did that with reservation dogs, we will see more and more Indigenous stories told by Indigenous people well into the future. And I think that that'll also be reflected in the musical landscape of popular music as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and Res Dogs has been like a huge vehicle for discovery of Native musicians, I think, for people that I know, Native and non-Native. So it's, yeah. John Carlos, so you are also an ethnomusicologist in addition to being a musician, of course. And I'm just wondering, how has the study of Native music or Native musicking changed in recent decades? And what advice do you have for anyone who's interested in researching or studying Native music academically as a musician or otherwise?
So, one of the things I faced when I first got started was it was kind of a two paths. The first was people said, okay, you're here to study now, you have to stop playing because you can't possibly do both at the same time. And in fact, to be legitimate, either as a performer or as a scholar, you only do that thing, right? So performers aren't supposed to study and scholars aren't supposed to play. And this to me is absolutely not what I understood, at least coming out of someone like Mantle Hood, was the point of ethnomusicology. Mantle Hood had this idea about bimusicality, that if you were going to be studying something else, you needed to learn not just how to play it, but you needed to understand its social, spiritual, economic, political contexts. Otherwise, what were you doing, right? And so part of what I think is so two things are changing. And part of it, I think, is that, right? The idea that you have to make a choice, right? Because the people who I grew up learning from had PhDs and played gigs, right? So it's not that I am a musician and also an ethnomusicologist. It's that how could I not do both, right? That's at least how I look at it, right? And that's something that I have been seeing changing lately. When people in the grad program at UW come to me and say, well, I'm still playing gigs, I say, okay, let's talk about it so that you can still play these gigs and you can still get your dissertation chapter in, but we can work this out, right? And it doesn't have to be this idealized idea that you have to pick one or another for some sort of specialization reason. That's someone else's idea. The other thing that has been changing since I went to graduate school, when I went to graduate school and they said, what do you want to do for your master's? And I said, well, I want to study powwow music. That's what I've been spending my life doing, all this stuff. And now I'm here. We have all these, I want to go into these archives and this is the stuff. You all have been listening to it. I want to listen to it. And they said, no, you can't do that. And I said, why not? And they said, you should go to Indonesia and study gamelan. And I said, why should I go to Indonesia? Not that gamelan music isn't beautiful, but they told me to go to Indonesia and study gamelan. I said, why? And they said, well, you can't study the thing that you come from because then you can't be objective about it. And of course, that's someone else's idea of what these words mean and what these processes are and what commitments we bring to the work we do as musicians. Right? So that idea, with some of the, there's only, as far as Jessica, my wife, Jessica Bishop Perea, as far as Jessica's research, there's 3 generations of Native identified people with music research PhDs. Of course, you take the PhD out and the thing blows up, right? But if we're talking about the PhD, which was part of your question, or at least the study, right? The institutional study, it's only 3 generations. The 4th generation is graduating. It has not fully changed for them, but many of them are starting to see that those old questions about objectivity and those questions about make a choice are beginning to change. It's not all there yet, but it's beginning to change. And I'm happy to see that, because I know that those questions were very difficult for me. And if I didn't come from the family that I came from and the support that I had, I might have made different decisions. But they said, no, you get back in there and fight it out. And I did. Right. So those are some of the things that have begun to change. Those making a space then for people to come in, develop their topics, and proceed with the kind of work that they want to do, not having to make a choice between someone else's idea of two poles.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
John
Oh, go
Carlos,
ahead.
I just want to jump in, and I just put it in the chat. I was looking into pursuing my PhD in ethnomusicology, and there were a couple of programs that were like, yeah, you could do it, but you have to learn a language. And I was like, okay, cool. Like I can learn an indigenous language. I can learn, my language, or if there was a culture within the US that I could, pursue or study. And they're like, no, it has to be like German or French or Italian. It's like, but that would have nothing to do with my dissertation. And I thought it was odd that there was such a sort of westernized focus on the study of ethnomusicology, that felt very, very restrictive and sort of kind of like, oh no, you're going to go down this hallway, as opposed to the one that actually is part of your passion, or what you want to actually investigate, right?
For me, when I first heard about ethnomusicology, I assumed that ethno, because of my background that I talked about here, I thought that was ethnic studies, right? And it wasn't until I got into graduate school that I realized that for a lot of the previous generations, ethno just meant other, right? And so that's why those programs that you're talking about are still out there, right? That's why I say it hasn't changed yet. That being said, I'm aware of a cohort of graduate students who are no longer being pressured, right? And that to me makes me really happy, right?
Yeah.
That they don't have to continue to make these choices, that they, and again, this separation, right, between the performer and the ethnomusicologist, when what we're talking about here are musicians, right? To be able to figure out what that means, what is an educated musician, and what are the various ways in which improvisation leads to that concept that is very specific to every individual. It's not something that can be generalized.
Yeah.
Right? Those are the kind of changes that I think I'm the most exciting about, then feeding audiences for the kind of grand stuff, for the kind and the other sort of broader public things, public audiences that you're talking about. That's the potential there for me.
Yeah. When I'm in Seattle next time, let's go get coffee and talk more about it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for answering all these questions. I'm going to open up the floor to anyone else who has any questions in the Q&A chat. Are there any questions in the Q&A?
While people are typing, could I just jump in with one other thing from your Sterling Harjo question? In addition to everything that was already said, which was wonderful, just as part of a yes and, thinking about representation, just the ways that he's brought hymns back into people's ears, right? And made that a subject. People were already doing it, right? But this may be the last time, and then the way that hymns came back all through Reservation Dogs. Now students come and say, well, that's not powwow, what is that? And it's just a whole other branch, right? A whole other way for us to be able to talk about, sure, a complicated history, but such beautiful music that in the context changed, right? Gave another space in order to be able to hear oneself and see oneself. So just to throw the hymns in there too, in agreement with what was already said.
Have you listened to Molly Obamsawin's album Sweet Tooth? Yeah. Wawa Sitonda is such it's a hymn. For those of you who haven't listened to Molly Obamsawin, she's Abenaki of Odanak First Nation. She has this amazing album called Sweet Tooth. It was her premiere album as a band leader, and she took a hymn and she really talks about the sort of the approach of colonization by way of using hymns and taking hymns and translating them into indigenous languages. And that was a way of sort of indoctrinating and eventually colonizing indigenous cultures. But what she does with that hymn and how she puts it into this sort of free jazz chamber music fusionally deliciousness that's just so powerful that I really hope I hope you all go and listen to. I'm always talking about Mali and always praising Mali and her music, but definitely go listen to Wawa Sitonda by Mali Obamso, and it speaks very much to what John Carlos just said.
Absolutely. And I want to add that she's actually coming to UNT next semester in February to perform. So any UNT or DFW folks, keep an eye out for that.
We do have a question in the chat. We have a couple more minutes. So April asks if you have any suggestions for creatives in general, they're visual artists, in using their creative practice to reconnect to their indigenous roots.
So I think this is a really great question. And April, it's such an individual practice for you, because your connection to your culture is something that is so unique to you. And as a result of genocidal practices and colonization, you know, we have that cultural disconnection. But, you know, using your art as a creative practice to reconnect, I mean, I think it's a beautiful practice. But also, one thing I do want to say is that you, as an Indigenous person, making your art makes it Indigenous art. Singing, you know, this idea that it has to be your mind's eye idea of what is Indigenous or what is Native or what is, you know, it doesn't have to fit some sort of stereotype in order for it to be valid Indigenous art or cultural connection. Your personal journey of connecting with your culture and expressing that through your art makes it Indigenous art. I think that's also part of our sort of decolonization practice, is that, you know, I'm a native musician. And while that might not fit someone's mind's eye of what a native musician is, the fact that I make this music, that I make music, makes it Indigenous music. I guess I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope that empowers you that it isn't one size fits all. It isn't monolithic, our approach to our cultural expression and cultural connection through our art. So yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you. And then one more question before we wrap up. An anonymous attendee says, thank you for leading the change with this cohort of students you are discussing. Why do you think these academic graduate music programs are so slow to change?
I think that in our present moment, there is a tremendous amount of fear for any number of various reasons. And I think on universities, that translates out to worries about funding, to worries about where's the funding going to come from, what's going to be there, what's going to get taken away, and for whom is this thing, right? I was raised with the idea that when you went to school, right, it wasn't that you were going away, because part of ethnic studies was to say that if we have this group of people who are from these various communities, right, that when you come here, you have the opportunity to maybe not find yourself, but find somebody who you are related to in the best sense, right, and to be able to have that connection. And for me, that connection was one through sound, right? I think that in the present context, right, there is a lot of fear over what those kind of changes mean, right? If we're jazz musicians, if we're hip hop artists, if we're creatives, right? Well, then who are we if somebody thought we were something else, right? And so for me, the part of what I'm doing is understanding the people who kept the door open for me to continue to ask these questions. I'm trying to do the same thing, right? My father, people would ask my father, did the strike succeed? And he would say, yes, the strike succeeded because what we wanted was a space to have these conversations. And as long as there's still a room, and as long as we're still in it, and as long as we're still talking about what's going to come next, right, then the strike succeeded, right? So for me, these kind of questions and the continuing momentum to enact change, to be able to have a Native American Student Association and a music association come together for something like this, I never would have thought, I never would have known when I started graduate school to be a part of a discussion like this, right? So it succeeded. It's still, the momentum is still there to figure out what we want, who even is we, right? And what can come out of that. And as I had said earlier, hopefully getting away from that older tendency to get into judging the branches and understand the tree, right? So I think the slow to change is fear, but I think events like today are part of keeping the momentum, right? Keeping the ball rolling to be able to get it to whatever the next thing needs to be. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here to be part of that.
That is an amazing way to end our discussion. Thank you so much. That was a great response.
Mic drop.
But yeah, once again, thank you so much, Dr. John Carlos Perea and Julia Keefe. I'm sure everyone's virtually applauding. Thank you so much for taking part. So.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, John Carlos. I'm so honored to have been on a panel with you, man. That was such a baller answer.
The feeling is mutual. Good to meet everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And if there's any other follow-up I can help with afterwards, Joseph, Megan, thank you very much, right? Just let me know what I can do.
Likewise, yeah. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for coming.
We'll see y'all later. Take care.